In the days of the war between gods and primordials, the living gate stood as a sentinel against the horrid Far Realm. Under the gate's watchful eye, the Far Realm's power remained in check. In time, mind flayers, beholders, and other aberrant monstrosities sundered the gate and surged forth to conquer, kill, and enslave. The living gate was not defeated so easily. Though its shattered pieces were spread across the cosmos, its will lived on. From its wreckage arose shardminds, psionic creatures whose bodies were composed of crystal. Driven by a racial memory as old as the cosmos itself, the shardminds seek to rebuild the living gate and end the Far Realm's foul influence. Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the show where we dig up old creatures from past editions of D&D and bring them to light for use in your current 5th edition D&D campaigns. My name is Josiah, also known as Dungeon Dad, and today we are talking about a very special monster from 4th edition. The Shardmind was originally introduced into 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons not just as a monster, but also as a playable character race. As you can see, they are humanoid creatures, but they are also constructs made up of crystalline bodies. But to understand what the Shardmind actually is, we're going to get into a little bit of lore here really quick. Without doing a super deep dive on 4th edition lore, basically what you need to understand is that at one point there was a massive gateway called the Living Gate that was at the center of the Astral Sea. This gateway was the only passage between our world and the Far Realm, which is where aberrations come from. Basically, the Cthulhu universe. That's where you get mind flayers and beholders and all those type of nasty creatures that just shouldn't be. Essentially, what happened was there was a giant war between the primordials and the gods, and in the process, the gateway was destroyed, thus allowing the Far Realm to reach its long, sickly tendrils into our world. And that's why we have mind flayers and beholders and all that other gross shit here now. So how does this relate even a little bit to the Shardmind? Well, that massive gateway was actually a sentient being. It was called the Living Gate for a reason. And it was made out of crystals. So as you can imagine, its identity was fractured along with its body, and these crystal shards were shattered and sent all throughout the multiverse. Enter the Shardmind. Shardminds are awakened pieces of that gate that are nowhere near as powerful as this massive entity that once existed, but each one possesses a small fraction of the Living Gate's power. And with their psionic ability, they're able to shape that crystal into whatever form they want. So they, of course, shape it into a humanoid form so they can venture out as individuals into the multiverse. So when you're looking at a Shardmind, the actual creature is this kind of pseudo-sentient psychic being that has latched onto the crystal and is forming it around itself. And this, of course, is why they are considered constructs. There's a lot of weirdness that goes on with these creatures, but don't worry, we are going to unpack it all. For those of you who are new here and don't already know, there is a 5th edition stat block conversion of the 4th edition monster in the description below. This was kind of an interesting one. As a humanoid monster, they can be very, very different. So there are 2 different monster stat blocks, one with a more martial focus and the other with a more psionic spellcasting focus. And you'll also find underneath the 2 stat blocks a section where I talk about using these creatures as a player race. So if you want to include these guys as a player option for your players in your 5th edition game, there's rules for that too. All of this, of course, is in a Google document which contains everything you need to run them, so take a look at that if you're interested. So as always, we're going to talk about combat and ways that these creatures fight, what their abilities are, and all that good stuff. And then we're going to move on to plot hooks and talk about some adventure inspirations and different ways you can use these creatures in your game, whether for just a single one-off encounter or as the focus of your next grand continent sweeping game. But before we get into what they are, we need to understand what they can do. So let's take a look at some. Much like every other humanoid creature, whether we're talking about orcs or hobgoblins, there's a variety of different roles and jobs that any Shardmind can take on. The Shardminds themselves, both from a physical and societal standpoint, lend themselves more to intellect. They tend to be more reliant on their intelligence because as psionic beings, that is just innately what they are. So when we look at the different types of Shardminds we see, you have to bear in mind that all of it is coming from this psionic being's approach. The first Shardmind stat block I want to talk about is the Shardmind Warseeker. The Warseeker is a more physical and martial focused version of the Shardmind. All Shardminds get access to an ability called Shard Swarm, which basically causes little parts of their body to split off and interfere with the creatures around them, meaning that all creatures within 5 feet of them are put under a fairy fire-like effect where all attacks have advantage against them. The Warseeker puts this to great effect because it's able to use this Shard Swarm ability as a bonus action, and then it comes swinging in with its greatsword for 2 attacks. That combination is going to be the bread and butter of what the Warseeker wants to do. It wants to get in close, use its psionic abilities to basically confuse its targets, thus granting it advantage, and then come in swinging. But that's not the only trick up its sleeve. It also has an ability called Psionic Rebuke, which is actually a reaction. This reaction is used whenever a creature that the Warseeker can see within 30 feet of it makes an attack roll targeting another creature other than itself. The Warseeker can cause that creature to take 1d8 psychic damage, and they have to make a DC 15 wisdom saving throw. If they fail, that creature is also stunned. This ability is invaluable to a group of Shardminds working together, because if you have some squishier members of the party who are maybe casting spells or doing other less melee combat-y things, if someone manages to break through the line and get up to them, the Warseeker can use its reaction to try to stun them to prevent them from even getting an attack off against the creature that the Warseeker wants to protect. Lastly, the Warseeker gains an ability called Furious Mind. This is kind of an enrage mechanic where once it reaches 42 hit points, which is half of its maximum, it goes berserk. It instantly gains an extra 10 temporary hit points, so it becomes a little bit harder to kill, and until it finishes a long rest, all melee attacks it makes are at disadvantage. That's very bad, but every time it does connect, it's going to add an extra 2d6 damage to the damage roll. This is basically meant to simulate the idea that this creature, as it becomes more unstable and parts of its body are being destroyed, it just kind of goes into a rage where it's not fighting as carefully as it normally would, but if it connects, it's going to be swinging down with terrible fury. Normally, getting all your attacks at disadvantage would suck a lot for a martial character, but because it has access to that Shard Swarm ability, it can impose advantage on the attack rolls, thus meaning all of its attacks will break even and it will swing neutrally, which isn't a bad trade-off for an extra 2d6 damage on up to 2 hits around. The second stat block I want to talk about here is the Shardmind Dominator. This is kind of meant to be your catch-all magical wizard type class. The Dominator, of course, has access to the Shard Swarm the same way that the Warseeker does. And granted, it's a little bit less useful on this creature than it is on the Warseeker because it's not going to be in melee combat. Another part of the Shard Swarm ability that I didn't mention before is at the end of the next turn, it allows the creature to teleport 10 feet. This teleportation is meant to represent that once the Shard Swarm ability is over, the creature is kind of reconstituting its body, maybe in a different spot if it doesn't want to be where it was before. So in the Dominator's case, it's unlikely to use this ability in much of an offensive capacity, but it can be a great way to do a pseudo Misty Step if it gets surrounded. When we actually look at the abilities of this creature, it becomes very obvious very quickly why it's called a Dominator. Its most powerful ability is an ability called Psionic Puppet. This effectively lets it cast the spell Dominate Person on any creature it can see within 60 feet. The target, of course, does get to make a saving throw, but it's a DC 17 intelligence save, so that's a tough save to make. The Dominator wants to pick out the most powerful opponent on the enemy's side and start using it against them. Continuing this theme of controlling the battlefield as well as your opponents, it also has access to an ability called Mind Swarm. This is a once per day ability that allows the Shardmind to create a 25-foot square area and basically put up this psychic field. Any creature that's within the psychic field when it's created has to make a saving throw for half damage on 5d6 psychic, which can hurt a lot. But most importantly, if a creature ends its turn within the psychic field, the Dominator can then move that creature up to half its speed in any direction it wants. That's a pretty niche ability, but when you really think about it, These guys are smart, so they're going to be using advanced combat tactics. Putting up a field that can control how your opponents are going to move at a good choke point, where you have maybe a couple War Seekers blocking the way, can be a very powerful move and help you set up combos to drop bigger spells or just set up an ideal situation for your melee combatants. Lastly, it has an ability called Overwhelming Mind. This allows it to target a creature within 60 feet and force a DC 17 intelligence saving throw. If that creature fails the save, the Shardmind can force it to move up to half its speed and make a melee or ranged attack against a creature of the Shardmind's choosing. So this isn't as bad as the true domination effect, but it is going to, again, allow the Shardmind to manipulate the battlefield a little bit and also get in a bit of extra damage against someone else. Suddenly, that +4 Holy Avenger the Paladin got a few quests ago doesn't look so friendly to your Tiefling Warlock. So those are the two types of Shardminds that I actually converted into 5th edition. Both of them are set up to work really well together, and I think you could make a really cool combat encounter just by using these stat blocks alone. But again, as humanoid creatures, they're not really limited in what you can do. So you could take any of the NPC stat blocks that exist in the Monster Manual or Volo's Guide or from wherever, and just make them a Shardmind, and just give them the Shardmind racial abilities. Or if you wanted to keep it really simple, just take the stat blocks that exist there and you could add on a couple abilities that are more thematic. Basically, you should look at this as a tool to use for an out-of-the-box encounter, but one that you can also add or remove things from to suit your own needs, because as humanoid creatures, they are quite diverse. The last thing I want to touch on here too is the Shardmind player race. As I mentioned previously, and as you can see in the stat block if you're following along, at the very bottom, there's a section about the Shardminds being used as PCs. The abilities there are pretty self-explanatory, but basically if you want to play a Shardmind, or a player in your game wants to play a Shardmind, they get a standard intelligence boost, and their second boost can be either to wisdom or charisma. And while they are constructs which don't need to eat, sleep, breathe, or age really for that matter, I've set them up to function very similarly to how the Warforged work. So while all of that is true about them, when they get to maintain that fantasy of being this kind of constructed crystalline entity, there are still rules in place, so they're not going to break the game by just being awake 24/7 and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And as I briefly mentioned, if you don't like the two Shardmind enemy stat blocks that are there and you want to make your own, this, even if you're not using it as a player, will be able to tell you what the Shardmind racial bonuses are that, like I said, you could tack on to another NPC stat block and make them a Shardmind. Now, with that said, let's move along and talk about some. When it comes to using a Shardmind in your game, the possibilities are near limitless. This is because, as humanoid creatures with their own sense of sentience and their own wants and needs and goals, you can pretty much use them however you want. I mean, you could literally run any module that exists and just swap out some of the NPCs and make them Shardminds instead of humans or dwarves or whatever they're supposed to be, if that's what you want to do. But talking strictly plot hooks that lend themselves to a Shardmind being involved, there's a few really cool ones that we can explore. For starters, this whole concept of the gateway to the far realm being shattered and all the Shardminds are little pieces of its consciousness trying to reconnect and reform that gate can be extremely compelling. That's kind of the baked-in Shardmind plot hook that exists with these creatures, and it's neat. You know, you could have Shardminds out there trying to gather up other Shardminds with the end goal being recreating the gate. And as far as how they go about doing that, well, that's something for you to decide as the DM, because the Shardminds themselves don't even know what the best way to do that is. There are 3 prominent schools of thought on the best way to restore the living gate, and I'm going to tell you what they are. The first and probably most prominent is the Thought Builders. They basically seek to create a new living gate. So they're trying to gather up as many other Shardminds as they can and get them all to come together to use their bodies and consciousnesses and psionic energy to rebuild a gate so they can kind of reform as this one singular gateway entity. The ultimate goal of this, of course, being to keep the creatures of the Far Realm back where they belong. That could be a really interesting plot point to explore, especially if you have a player in the party who's a Shardmind, because how do they feel about that? Is their ultimate goal to kind of go along with this and make it happen? Or are they reticent because they like their newfound individuality? The second school of thought here, which lends itself much more to those types of individuals, is that of the God Shard. This sect of the Shardmind culture basically believes that every Shardmind needs to become as powerful as possible, and only by doing so can they gain the power they need to keep creatures of the Far Realm at bay. They think that it's pointless to actually create a new living gate where they can just act as wards of the multiverse. This can be a really cool plot point as well, whether it's for a person in your party or just an NPC, where they basically just like hate aberrations, you know? They could contract the party to help them take out a mind flayer hive. Or perhaps there's a beholder that's been running amok and they're hunting them down and they offer the party some type of reward to help them on their quest. If you want to run an aberration against your campaign of any kind, a Shardmind coming to the party and being like, hey, you guys seem powerful, want to help me kill this gross thing, can be a really compelling and interesting way to do that. So that's something to consider next time you're building an Aboleth encounter. Lastly, we have the Shard Slayers. The Shard Slayers are a little bit more brutal and kind of bordering on the evil alignment. They have an understanding that whenever a Shardmind is killed and destroyed, the psionic energy is released from its body, where it will eventually go back and find another piece of the crystal gateway. It will then, of course, reform eventually, awakening anew, but it will basically be a completely different person. It's just kind of reincarnating that energy. So the Shard Slayers seek out other Shardminds with the express purpose of killing them, because they believe if they can kill and destroy enough of their own kind, all that psionic energy will reform the original gate, which was destroyed in time immemorium. All three of these approaches are probably valid and have a means to actually function, and you can do whatever you want with that. I mean, if you wanted to really go down this great gateway plot and build a campaign around it, you could have these three different sectors of Shardminds, and maybe the players are playing either as part of or helping one of these sects, and that could result in some really interesting drama and some really cool encounters. On a much smaller scale, regarding the Shard Slayers, perhaps the party comes across a Shardmind that is not part of the Slayers, and the Slayers are hunting them down. Does the party hand them over? Do they protect this person? How do they handle that? That could be a really fun one-off kind of moral decision encounter that the party gets to make. The Shard Slayers might even be offering a reward if they turn in this person that they're protecting. And if you didn't want to make that just a one-off, maybe that kind of gets them embroiled in this grand Shardmind plot that's going on. Something else I want to point out here too is that if you look at these creatures and you go, wow, they sound so cool, but I hate all of the lore behind them, that's fine. As I've said many times in many different videos, we can throw all that in the bin if we want to. You can just have them be spontaneously awakened crystal entities. Maybe they don't even know the origins of their minds or why they've awakened as what they are, and that could be a really interesting plot point for them trying to discover where they came from. Or who knows, maybe you come up with your own cool lore behind it, which would give any player who's playing as one of these guys a really neat secret to discover. Another point that's worth mentioning is if you want to use maybe a Dominator type Shardmind creature as the primary antagonist of a campaign, I could see a really cool lower level game where one of these guys has dominated a bunch of other monsters which are easy to dominate, like bugbears and goblins and even just vicious beasts, to do its bidding. Maybe a small village is being attacked by orcs constantly, and it's outside of the raiding season, and they're even more aggressive than usual, and perhaps they're not even taking gold. They're just taking supplies that they need to survive, and the odd trinket here or there. And what's actually going on is a Shardmind has dominated all of these orcs and is using them as a means to try to find some type of powerful psionic artifact it thinks is somewhere within this village. And that could be a really cool twist to put on the typical orcs attacking a small village trope. I can practically hear the players' eyes rolling as they see the first orcs on the horizon, only to encounter these orcs that are fighting with incredibly advanced tactics beyond what we typically think of when we think about orcs, and also just remaining completely silent as their minds are being dominated and just basically not behaving like orcs. There's all kinds of different ways you can use these monsters, and whether you're using them as a one-off encounter, the focus of a campaign, you're creating new lore for them, using the old stuff, a mixture of both, or you're letting one of your players use this player race option to kind of add a bit of spice to your D&D campaign that you might not otherwise find. I think that they're just a very cool race race, and it gives us another humanoid type of creature that's weird enough that it's different from all the other humanoid monsters we have. And I think that's pretty cool. So on that note, if you want to use these monsters, there is a link in the description to a Google document which contains everything you will need to run these creatures or use them as PC options. And if you are one of my lovely patrons, you will find the full 3-page PDF stat block with all the player options and everything in there, along with a bunch of extra lore and the other 2 stat blocks for the 2 different Shardmind examples I gave you. If you're not already subscribed to the Patreon, please consider checking it out. It's $3 a month and you get a cool stat block every week. And all my patrons, including those at the $1 tier, get access to behind-the-scenes footage when it pops up, along with polls and that kind of thing, which help me decide what type of content to make in the future. But most of all, it definitely helps support me and keep on making content that I love to make. But in any case, thank you so much just for watching, for being here, for liking, commenting, all that good stuff. Make sure you tell your friends so that they too can play as Crystalman. And of course, if you have a monster you would like to see show up on Monster of the Week, or maybe you have some other plot hook ideas for the Shardmind, please leave a comment as well so I can take a look at that. I'll add those monsters to the list, and who knows, your plot hook might show up on a future episode of Plot Hooks Extended. Until the next one, I'll see you there. I think the next urban campaign setting I play is going to be a Shardmind crystal meth dealer.